There's several steps that you kind of go through with an oil spill, as well as I understand. Obviously, prevention being first, and you would like to collect as much of it as you can, but it's really not feasible to collect all of the oil that's spilled because it's just vast amounts. And so what dispersants do is you're able to direct where the oil goes. So rather than it being at the surface level and potentially affecting shorelines and surface animals, you can use it to, it lowers surface tension and allows you to make little drops of oil instead of an oil slick, and those drops of oil will be carried down into the water column and able to, it's diluted because it's going through the whole depth of the ocean, and it also increases surface area, which means that bacteria that will naturally eat it can access the oil more easily, and so it can increase biodegradation. So this is a oil droplet on a needle in salt water. This is with time, pictures taken with time. The carbon black, initially it's an opaque black solution. We add salt and they will clump together, flocculate, and settle with time. And these are some pictures taken with time as we were siphoning off the water. And you can see, we saw the large pieces just fly off and spin around, but no matter how much we agitated the system, we weren't able to get all of the carbon black off. The particles that were actually at the interface remained at the interface regardless of what we were able to do. So some of my collaborators are working with modifying the surface so that it can absorb PAHs, which are toxic aromatics, which are common in oil spills. So this has potential to not only be used to stabilize emulsions, but can at the same time be collecting some other toxic elements. And so that's one of the big draws to particles.
This represents the work that my lab has done in 2013 to analyze the sediment in the Gulf of Mexico. We go on NOAA cruise ships and collect sediment from multiple sites, and then we analyze the sediment not only for its chemical characteristics such as trace metals and PAHs, things like that, but we also look at the microscopic animals that live in the sediment, such as the copepods and the nematodes and the mud dragons. And so we're not only doing a community analysis of these animals, we're also finding new species of animals through this ecological research. For example, we have what we believe are over 20 new species of mud dragons that we're in the process of describing and writing up those species descriptions for. Okay, this project is funded through GOMRI. This is an RFP2 funded project, and they're providing me the funding to go and out onto the NOAA ships and to collect this sediment and just to do the analysis of if there is any effect of the oil spill at this particular contour line. Are there any residual effects of the oil that we can detect now? If so, does this relate to the microscopic animals that we see in the sediment? Here we have a chinorhynch. These are also known as mud dragons. These are the animals that we've seen the most new species for. This is a roundworm or a nematode. We've already found a number of new records of genera for the Gulf of Mexico that were never known to exist in the Gulf. This is a new species of mollusk. It's a microscopic mollusk that's about a half a millimeter long, and we're in the process of getting more specimens of that so we can write up a species description for it. So it's very exciting. Not only can we do the ecology and the community analysis and relating that to the sediment characteristics, we're also creating new records of animal life in the Gulf.
We are looking at sort of developing a positive control using an animal model, specifically with the alligator, for future exposure studies related to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Looking specifically at endocrine disruption and as a mechanism of skewing sex ratios as well as potentially inducing obesity. Some preliminary evidence has suggested that maybe it could be playing a role in that. We're not using oil at all. We're using a known disruptor that activates certain receptors that are part of the pathway towards obesity. So we have a proposed mechanism, and so we're using the chemicals that are agonists of these receptors to see how that affects for potentially using oil in future studies. We have a proposed, we have a hypothesized mechanism for, how this might work, and so we're using one component of it, looking at just one question, and so trying to answer that question, see how that can be answered, to then create more questions for the next one. And so from this, we're getting, we start with our main question, and then oh, well, that's not how we expected it. Why did that happen? How did that happen? Sort of looping back and trying to expand upon those results. The chemical that we're using is known to affect the sex ratios in gastropods and some teleost fish species. The alligator is really great because it doesn't have sex chromosomes. It has temperature-dependent sex determination, and so it's very sensitive to hormone levels and chemicals in the environment. So we can look at just the effects of these chemicals essentially without having to deal with, well, it's a male, so does that mean this, or it's a female, does that mean that? And so I guess our most exciting result so far is actually up here. We've actually seen a delay in hatch timing with exposure to tributyl-10, and so we're looking at sort of how that could possibly come about. We're not sure exactly, but we have plans to look at specific assays to see if the different pathways are actually being affected to cause this delay. First up, we're going to be looking at gene expression levels to see if there's any change in different organs throughout the animals, as well as investigating that delay timing, and eventually, hopefully, to use oil and ask these same questions with oil and dispersants as well.
So for an oil spill, usually what people use as dispersants are surfactants, but surfactants are known to have toxic effects on aquatic environment, and also when we have surfactant molecules on an oil drop, the surfactant molecules, when it's exposed to a lot of seawater, it dissolves from an oil-water interface, so you don't have a stable oil drop in water. Now the question which comes to us is why we need an oil drop. We need an oil drop so that the oil-degrading bacteria can grow on them and degrade the oil naturally. So what we're using is we're trying to use particles so that the particles can go to the oil-water interface and stabilize the drop. So we use carbon black particles, and these particles, along with the salt from the seawater, can form these stable drops of oil in water. So what we show here is crude oil in water emulsions. So these are basically drops of crude oil which is stabilized by carbon black, and they are stable for months. And we also compare this with Corexit 9500, which was used in the oil spill. And what we show here is that over a long time we get drops of water in oil instead of oil drops in water. And why that's bad is because oil, when you have water drops in oil, the calorific value of oil decreases, and at the same time it becomes very viscous, so it becomes tough for cleaning of the oil from the bodies of animals which get stuck in this crude oil. After this, what we also show is that these particles can absorb PAH, which are harmful chemicals in the crude oil, and prevent it from going from the oil phase to the aqueous phase. So the next experiments which we're doing are called wave tank experiments, and we'll be doing in a Navy facility in New Jersey. And what we'll be doing is we'll be testing these dispersants with crude oil. So we're doing some lab scale experiments where we have this container with seawater, we put octane, which is an oil, and then we spray the carbon black from here. And finally, we see that we also get drops of oil in water. So what it shows us is that when we have a wave action, if we have a surface spill, we can spray the carbon black particles and it can still form stable drops of oil in water. The other experiment which we are doing is also looking at Arctic conditions, because when we do oil exploration in Arctic, there's often spills of oil. So what people tend to use is surfactants, but surfactants cannot be used at very low temperatures. So we're trying to use particles, and we show that even with carbon black at very low temperatures, we can stabilize these drops of oil. There has been recent studies which shows that Corexit has negative impacts on aquatic life. But the advantage of having a particle is that the particles will always form these stable drops of oil. And as they are very biocompatible, so oil-degrading bacteria can grow on these oil drops and basically decompose this oil naturally. At the same time, we have also shown that these particles, when they are at this interface, they can actually absorb PAH, which is a bad stuff in the crude oil, and prevent it from going to the aquasphere. So that way what it will do is it will not only stabilize the droplet, but also it will absorb the bad stuff from the crude oil and prevent it from going to the seawater. So we are saying that we have multiple purpose of using these particles. Not only does it form an emulsion, but it also does some other jobs. And there's also this advantage of using this particle at very low concentration, so it won't have much impact to the environment. So we can either inject it directly into a spot of an oil spill where we can form these very small drops, or we can spray it on the surface and form these stable drops.
What we're trying to understand is both the impact and the recovery of coastal marshes to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So this is a multi-disciplinary type of study where we have a number of different areas covered in which we're trying to assess the degree to which the oil has impacted vegetation along the coast, the animals that grow on the marsh vegetation and on the surface of the marsh. And we're also interested in how the oil has impacted the microbial community within the marsh soil. And finally, we're interested in how this oil might have affected the algae that can grow, this microalgae that can grow right on the surface of the marsh. And all of these different components of the wetland ecosystem are interrelated. The marsh vegetation has an influence on the animals that grow in the soil. So if the marsh vegetation is affected by the oiling, then you might see an effect on the animals or an effect on the microbial community within the soil. But it's not only the impacts we're looking at, we're also very interested in the recovery, because some of these marshes are recovering, and it depends on the degree of oiling they receive. So if the marshes only receive moderate oiling, we're seeing better recovery, sometimes complete. Where the marshes are more heavily oiled, we see very small amounts of recovery. And so we're looking at this over time, this ability of the wetlands to recover as time progresses. The Deltaic Wetlands of coastal Louisiana have about 40% of the coastal wetlands in the 48 conterminous United States. And these wetlands are extremely important for habitat, for recreational and commercial fish, as support for a variety of animals. They provide a number of ecosystem services. And of course, in addition, our wetlands are rapidly, naturally deteriorating due to both natural and man-induced causes. So if an oil spill occurs and there's an impact, then and that impact influences the extent to which there might be more degradation of marshes, then that's very important, because we're already losing very high numbers of wetlands. We're also looking at ways by which we might be able to remediate the impacts, to restore marshes that have been oiled and in the more heavily oiled areas, possibly denuded of vegetation. So we're planting different species of vegetation, and we're adding different amendments to try to speed up the rate at which they might grow and recover in these wetlands. And so we're very interested in trying to identify, after there's been an effect, how rapidly and by what means can we restore these wetlands that were impacted.